The results are printed on a single sheet, and a woman in a paper gown is staring at one line she does not understand. Her doctor taps a small, soft swelling at the front of her throat, just below the voice box, and says the word for the first time. Thyroid. She has felt wrong for months. Tired in a way sleep does not fix. Cold when the room is warm. Her heart running slow. Her thoughts moving as if through syrup. All of it, the doctor explains, traces back to this one small butterfly-shaped gland wrapped around her windpipe, a thing she never knew she had until it faltered. She presses her fingers to her throat and feels it there, quiet and strange. And she has no idea that she is touching one of the oldest organs in her body, older than lungs, older than legs, an organ that began its life not as a gland at all, but as a mouth trying to eat. We think of the thyroid as a purely human piece of hardware, a gland, a control dial for energy and warmth, part of the standard machinery of a modern body. That is the story most of us carry, and it is almost entirely backwards. The thyroid is not a modern invention at all. It is a relic, a made-over piece of ancient plumbing, and the job it does today, quietly setting the pace of every cell you own, is a second career. Its first career was something so different you would never guess it. And here is the part that should sit with you as you swallow. That ancient organ is not a museum piece locked in the past. It is running in your throat right now, using a trick it first learned in the sea, long before anything like you existed. To understand what the thyroid really is, we cannot start in a doctor's office. We have to rewind, far past the first humans, past the first animals with backbones you would recognize, past the first jaws and the first teeth, back to a warm, ancient sea where our ancestors had no head worth the name, no brain to speak of, and spent their whole lives doing one thing: eating water. So carry two questions with you as we sink down through time. What was this organ doing before it ever became a gland? And once its first job vanished, why did evolution keep it, rebuild it, and hand it the keys to your entire metabolism? Begin in the shallows, because that is where the story starts. Picture a creature so simple it barely counts as an animal. A slender, boneless sliver of flesh half buried in the sand of an ancient seabed, filtering the water for scraps too small to see. It has no true head, no eyes worth mentioning, no jaws. What it has is a pharynx, a long slotted basket at its front end, and it feeds by dragging seawater in through its mouth and straining it through that basket, trapping specks of food and letting the water flow out the sides. This is not imagination. Animals built almost exactly like this are still alive today, small filter feeders that show us, in the flesh, what our own distant ancestors likely looked like before bones, before brains, before the land. It is worth sitting in that world for a moment, because it was nothing like ours. No grass, no trees, no bird song, no dry ground at all, only warm, shallow water stretching in every direction, thick with drifting specks of life. There were no hunters worth fearing yet, no jaws to bite, no eyes to track you. Survival was not about speed or strength. It was about one slow, endless task, pulling enough food out of the water to keep living. Our ancestors were not predators or prey. They were strainers, quiet tubes of flesh lying in the current, and everything they would ever become was built on top of that single, humble habit of filtering the sea. Now look closer at the floor of that feeding basket, because this is where everything begins. Running along the bottom of the pharynx is a narrow groove lined with cells that pour out sticky mucus. As water rushes through, this groove lays down a moving sheet of slime, a living flypaper that catches food particles and sweeps them, by the beating of tiny hairs, back toward the gut. This mucus groove has a name: the endostyle. It is the animal's whole feeding apparatus, its net and its conveyor belt in one. And this humble, slimy trench, sitting in the throat of a brainless filter feeder, is the organ that will one day become your thyroid. But a mucus trap is a long way from a metabolic control gland, so the story cannot stop at feeding. Look harder at the endostyle, because it has a strange and fateful side habit. The cells lining that groove do not only make mucus, they also grab a particular element out of the seawater and lock it into the sticky sheet, an element dissolved all around them in the ocean. Iodine. No one planned this. It was likely just useful chemistry, a way of treating the mucus so it worked better as a trap. But in doing so, this feeding groove became something no other part of the body could do. It became the one place that could catch iodine from the water and bind it into the stuff of the body. Think about how quietly momentous that was. Iodine is not an easy element to handle. It is rare in most places, easily lost, and the body cannot make it from scratch. Not then and not now. But in that ancient ocean it was simply there, dissolved in every mouthful of water an animal strained. So the endostyle never had to hunt for it. It only had to grab what was already flooding past. That easy abundance is the reason the whole trick could take root at all. And, as we will see, it is also the reason this organ would one day become a source of trouble. Hold on to that, because iodine is the thread that ties this whole story together. In that ancient sea, iodine was everywhere, dissolved freely in the water our ancestors were straining all day long. The endostyle was swimming in it, and by the accident of using iodine to treat its mucus, that feeding groove had, without knowing it, built the one skill your thyroid still lives by. The ability to seize iodine and weld it into a molecule. The organ that would one day govern your body heat began as a mouth that happened to be good at chemistry. So now the story reaches its hinge, the single strangest chapter. And to see it, we need a creature that lives out this whole transformation in a single lifetime. There is a fish, ancient and jawless, that still does exactly that. The lamprey. And the young lamprey, the larva, is the ghost of our deep past made flesh. It does not hunt. It does not have jaws. It buries itself in riverbed mud and feeds, for years, exactly like that boneless ancestor, straining water through a pharynx lined with a mucus groove. The larval lamprey has an endostyle. It is filter feeding, catching iodine, living the old life, right now, in rivers you could visit today. And then something extraordinary happens. The larva grows up. As it transforms into an adult, its body remodels itself, and the endostyle does not simply fade away. It changes. That mucus-feeding groove reorganizes, loses its old feeding role, and becomes a cluster of rounded sacs, a true thyroid gland, tucked into the throat of the adult animal. The very same tissue that spent years straining food from the water is rebuilt, in a matter of weeks, into a gland that pours a hormone into the blood. You are watching, in one small fish, the exact conversion that took our lineage hundreds of millions of years. The mouth becomes the gland, the feeding groove becomes the thyroid. And this is not some quirk of one strange fish. Follow any animal with a backbone, from fish to frog to bird to the person reading this, and you find the same gland in the same place, built the same way, running the same iodine trick. It is a shared inheritance, handed down unbroken from those filter-feeding ancestors to every creature that carries a spine. When you touch your own throat, you are touching a structure that a fish, a lizard, and a whale would all recognize as their own. Which means the answer to our first question is now in plain sight. The thyroid was never designed as a gland. It is a feeding organ that changed jobs. Everything strange about it makes sense once you know it started as a mucus trap in the throat of a filter feeder. Why does it sit where it does, wrapped around the windpipe at the base of the throat? Because that is where the old feeding basket was. Why is iodine, of all the elements, the one nutrient your thyroid cannot live without? The one thing it will ransack your body to find? Because iodine was the trick the endostyle stumbled onto in the ancient sea, and your gland never let it go. You are not using iodine because a gland arbitrarily needs it. You are using iodine because your ancestors were filtering it out of seawater before they had faces. But this raises the real mystery, the puzzle that turns the whole thing from a curiosity into something deeper. If the endostyle's original job was feeding, and that job disappeared the moment our ancestors stopped filtering water for a living, why keep the organ at all? Evolution is ruthless with tools that stop being used. It has erased eyes, dissolved limbs, thrown away whole structures the instant they stopped paying their way. So why, when the feeding basket was abandoned, was this one slimy groove not simply discarded with it? Why rebuild it, of all things, into a master switch for the entire body? To answer that, we have to stop describing and start investigating. Here is the first clue. The molecule the endostyle was making, iodine welded into a small compound, turned out to be far more powerful than a feeding aid had any right to be. In the body of a developing animal, that iodine-bearing molecule could do something remarkable. It could act as a signal, a chemical messenger that told cells when to change, when to grow, when to transform from one stage of life into the next. The proof is still running in that lamprey. The same hormone the rebuilt gland releases is what drives the larva's metamorphosis into an adult. The molecule, born as a byproduct of feeding, had become a trigger for transformation. Picture what that means for a young lamprey buried in the mud. For years it lies there, filtering, catching iodine, going nowhere. Then the rebuilt gland releases its hormone into the blood, and that single chemical signal reaches every corner of the body at once, telling tissue after tissue that the time has come to change. The mouth reshapes. The body remakes itself for a new life. One molecule, first stumbled upon while treating feeding slime, now conducts an entire animal through the most dramatic passage of its life. That is a staggering promotion for a humble piece of ocean chemistry. And that is the hinge on which the whole survival of the organ turns. Once that iodine-bearing molecule became a signal for growth and change, the endostyle was no longer just a mouthpart. It had accidentally become an endocrine gland, a source of a hormone the body could use to coordinate itself. So when the filter-feeding way of life finally ended, when our ancestors grew jaws and began to hunt and eat in an entirely new way, the feeding function of the endostyle was indeed thrown out, but the organ itself was not. Because by then it was doing a second, far more valuable job. It was no longer catching food. It was controlling the body. So evolution did the thing it does best. It did not invent a new gland from scratch. It took the old feeding groove, kept the one skill that still mattered, the iodine-catching chemistry, and repurposed the whole structure into a pure hormone factory. The mucus and the filtering fell away. The iodine trick stayed. And the small compound that once treated slime in a feeding basket was refined into the hormone that now sets the tempo of your metabolism, the speed of your heartbeat, the warmth of your skin, the pace of a child's growing brain. The organ survived not because its first job lasted, but because it had quietly grown a second one that the body could never again do without. That is the button on the mystery. The thyroid persists because it is woven into the body's development so deeply that it cannot be removed without unraveling the animal itself. It is not a leftover kept out of laziness. It is a repurposed relic, an ancient piece of feeding equipment promoted to run the whole factory floor. Evolution kept it for the same reason a builder keeps a good foundation while tearing down the house above it. The structure was already there, already skilled, already wired in. It was far easier to give it a new job than to build a control gland from nothing. And that is worth pausing on, because it overturns how we tend to imagine evolution. We picture it inventing, designing, crafting each organ for its purpose. But far more often it does something humbler and stranger. It scavenges. It takes whatever is already lying around, a feeding groove, a spare piece of tissue, an old chemical habit, and presses it into a brand new service. Never mind how the piece first came to be. Your thyroid is one of the clearest fossils of that habit anywhere in your body. Nobody designed it to run your metabolism. An old mouthpart simply fell into the job and never let go. There is one more turn in the story, and it is the price of leaving the sea. For as long as our ancestors lived in the ocean, iodine was free and endless, and the thyroid never wanted for the one element it was built around. Then, across immense stretches of time, our lineage crawled onto land, and the water that had bathed every cell in iodine was gone. Suddenly, the gland that could not work without iodine was living in a body that had to find it in food, in soil, in scarce and scattered traces, far from the flooded abundance of the sea. And here, the ancient design shows its seams. In places where the soil and water hold little iodine, the thyroid, starved of the one thing it needs, swells and strains as it tries to do its job, producing the visible lump in the throat that people have known and feared for a very long time. That swelling is not a modern disease. It is the sound of an ocean organ crying out for the sea it left behind, an ancient chemistry struggling to run in a world that no longer hands iodine to it for free. The gland never forgot the ocean. The ocean is simply no longer there to feed it. And this is where the woman in the paper gown comes back, because her story is this story. When her thyroid slows, when it fails to pour out enough of that ancient iodine-bearing hormone, her whole body loses its pace. She feels cold because the signal that keeps her cells burning fuel has gone quiet. She feels tired and slow because the tempo of her metabolism, the very thing that molecule sets, has dropped. Every symptom she cannot explain is the sound of an ancient sea creature's feeding chemistry running low. The trick the endostyle learned in the ocean is the trick her life still depends on, and when it falters, she feels the ocean go still inside her. Now step back and feel the whole distance we have traveled. We began with a woman touching a small, strange swelling at her throat, frightened by an organ she never knew she had. We ended in a warm, ancient sea, watching a brainless sliver of flesh strain water through a slimy groove, catching iodine by accident, building a skill that would outlive its own purpose by hundreds of millions of years. That butterfly-shaped gland in your neck is not a modern part. It is the made-over mouth of a filter feeder, still clutching the one chemical trick it learned before our ancestors had eyes. And here is what stays with you once the sheet of results is folded away. The thyroid is not finished, not a fossil, not a spare part. It is working in your throat at this very moment, seizing iodine from the food you eat exactly as its ancestor seized it from the sea, welding it into the same kind of molecule, releasing it to keep the fire of your body burning at the right heat. Every time you feel warm, every time your heart keeps its steady time, every time a child grows, that ancient feeding groove is still at work, still doing chemistry it invented in an ocean that vanished before there was anything human to remember it. So the next time you swallow and feel that small gland shift in your throat, remember what it truly is. Not a simple dial, not a modern gland, the living descendant of a mouth that fed on the sea, rebuilt into the quiet engine of your entire body, still burning with a trick older than bone. If that thought lingers even a little, then stay with me. Your body is full of these made-over relics, ancient organs quietly living second and third lives inside you. And every one of them carries a story just as deep and just as alive as this one.